You might find it hard to believe, but there was a time not too long ago when Venezuela was the envy of all of Latin America. It was a prosperous country where many people moved to chase opportunities hidden in its currency, the bolivar. But now, if you ask anyone, the first thing that comes to mind about Venezuela's economy is hyperinflation. It's no wonder. Venezuela has turned into a place where the money you once used to buy a lavish car now barely covers the cost of a coffee, thanks to rising prices. The truth is, after nearly 30 years of the Bolivarian Revolution, Venezuela is in ruins. It's facing a severe economic crisis, causing millions of Venezuelans to leave in search of a better life. But how did it all come to this? Well, Venezuela has the biggest known reserves of regular oil on the entire planet. We're talking about over 300 billion barrels of oil. Venezuela has more oil than Russia or Saudi Arabia. And it's not just oil. There are also lots of other natural resources: iron, gold, diamonds, and gas. There was a time when Venezuelans really knew how to make the most of all this incredible wealth. I'm talking about the 1970s. Back then, things in Venezuela were really going well. They were going so well that a phrase used by many Venezuelans in many shops, especially when traveling abroad, became almost a national saying: "It's cheap. Give me two." You see, in those years, there was money, people were making money, and most importantly, the currency had good value compared to the rest of Latin America. Those were happy times. The bolivar, the currency, was a symbol of what made Venezuela a top country in the 20th century. A country that moved up in society with big infrastructure projects and became a big draw for thousands of Latin American and European immigrants. Everyone wanted a piece of the Venezuelan boom. However, it's clear that one day all this prosperity will come to an end. So, the first question we can ask ourselves now is, how did Venezuela manage to become such a prosperous country? One reason: oil, the so-called black gold. Let's go back to 1973. In October of that year, the Arab countries in OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, decided to punish the nations that had supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. This move led to a major cut in global oil production, hitting the world market practically overnight. The impact was immediate. In a short time, the price of a barrel of oil skyrocketed from about $1.60 to nearly $10. Suddenly, oil-producing countries, including Venezuela, found themselves wealthy beyond imagination. Not only did prices surge, but Western powers also eagerly paid for Venezuelan oil. Petrodollars flooded in, and in 1975, President Carlos Andrés Pérez nationalized all oil and established PDVSA. The bulk of the petrodollars started pouring into the state coffers, which unfortunately began spending lavishly. Those were the wild years of Venezuela. By 1977, the average income per person in Venezuela had nearly doubled that of the rest of Latin America. But when a government suddenly receives such a windfall, it faces two choices: either spend recklessly or invest wisely to bolster the national economy. Unfortunately, Venezuela opted for the former. The country accumulated debts without much regard for global economic shifts. Then, by 1981 and 1982, the price of oil plummeted drastically, slashing more than 30% of the country's oil revenues. This posed a significant problem because, despite record-high oil revenues, the reduction dealt a devastating blow to a country burdened with debt, rampant consumerism, and widespread corruption. Adding to the crisis, international banks demanded repayment of loans extended in previous decades. In 1982, Venezuela had to settle a $16 billion external debt, which accounted for 82% of that year's oil exports. All of this exploded in the social upheaval of February 1983, known as Black Friday. On that day, the government under then-President Luis Herrera Campins announced a sharp devaluation of bolivar. It marked the end of a 22-year period of the greatest exchange rate and monetary stability ever seen in any Latin American country. Following this, currency controls with 3 exchange rates were enforced, where the government allocated foreign currencies to citizens and businesses at specific prices based on their intended use. The devaluation overnight impoverished wage earners, retirees, and anyone who had their savings in bolívares. which lost 70% of their value. It also exposed that the prior year's growth relied heavily on public spending, promoting an import-based economy. Despite significant investments to diversify the productive sector, the objectives weren't met. In simple terms, this event was one of the initial blows to a bolivar that has been in free fall ever since, plummeting at an unprecedented speed. Now, let's go to the period when the bolivar suffered the most. On December 6, 1998, a significant event occurred in Venezuela that changed the country's history forever. Hugo Chavez Frias, a former commander of the Venezuelan army, won the presidential elections for the first time, becoming the new president of the country. This marked the beginning of Chavismo and socialism in Venezuela. To be fair, Chavez's government didn't start off as bad as many think. Like before, Venezuela's economy was heavily influenced by oil prices, and fortunately, in just 8 years, the country's GDP nearly tripled. This allowed Hugo Chavez's government to implement anti-poverty plans, expand public enterprises, and subsidize basic products like oil and electricity. But it was all a facade. Venezuela still hadn't solved its long-standing structural problems. It was still heavily reliant on oil revenue, which worked well until 2014. Because then, the price of oil dropped by over 60%, causing most of the government's revenue to disappear. This meant the government didn't have enough money to cover its massive spending. You'd think in this situation, expert economists would step in to find a solution, but instead, the government started printing money like crazy, leading to hyperinflation that left the country with beautiful bills that were practically worthless. But who suffered the most? The people. The financial hit led to street protests that the government tried to suppress by force. Now, not only was Venezuela seen as a broke country internationally, but also as a human rights violator. In March 2014, just a month after the protests began, the U.S. Congress, along with the Barack Obama administration, passed a law to punish Venezuelan leaders responsible for the violent acts. Initially, the sanctions targeted specific individuals, freezing their bank accounts and restricting their business dealings in the U.S. The goal was to punish the oppressors without hurting the entire country or prompting a regime change. However, everything changed in 2017 when Donald Trump became president. He imposed even tougher sanctions on Venezuela, blocking the Venezuelan government's access to the U.S. financial system completely. These new sanctions left President Maduro without access to benefits and unable to obtain new credit to fund his government. The aim was clear: to further weaken Maduro's government, especially economically. However, over the years, Venezuela not only failed to change its president, but also surprisingly experienced an improvement that slowed down inflation by at least a few digits. The Venezuelan hyperinflation that started in 2014 dragged on for years. The Central Bank of Venezuela didn't talk about inflation rates from December 2015 through 2016, 2017, and 2018. It wasn't until May 2019 that they admitted to hyperinflation, reaching a staggering 53,798, 500%. Just imagine that prices in Venezuela were doubling or even tripling every 10 days. To avoid a situation like Zimbabwe's $10 million bill, the Venezuelan government removed up to 14 zeros from the currency's value through various conversions, calling it El Fuerte or El Soberano. But it didn't really help the people much. Now, you might be wondering, why did Venezuelans keep using bolívares for so long with such crazy inflation? Well, they really had no choice. Maduro's government didn't like Venezuelans using dollars for everyday transactions as an alternative to the worthless bolivar. It wasn't technically illegal to use dollars, but products had to be sold at the official exchange rate set by the Venezuelan central bank, which nobody wanted to accept. In theory, using dollars was allowed, but in reality, it was almost impossible due to restrictions on buying foreign currencies and the existence of a black market for currency exchange. Even today, Venezuelans still resort to this informal dollar exchange system, like the Dollar Today page, which establishes a different exchange rate from the official one, usually higher. So why do they do it? Because of the government's restrictions, they have no other option. What's really interesting is that Venezuela's situation has changed completely recently. Last year, the annual inflation rate dropped to 189.8%, one of the lowest figures in recent years. Even Argentina has higher inflation, over 200%. Does that mean Venezuela is fixed? Not by a long shot, but we can see some reasons why this is happening. One of them is the widespread use of the dollar by Venezuelans. In March 2019, a huge blackout lasting about a week hit Venezuela. Satellite images showed that more than half of the country was completely dark. Chaos ensued. People feared running out of food or having it spoil, so they rushed to stores to buy whatever they could. But picture this, with no access to digital banks, they had to pay in cash. With such high inflation, even buying a loaf of bread meant paying a lot of bills that many people simply didn't have. The solution? Using US dollars. Where the bolivar failed, having savings in dollars was a lifesaver for many. And by the time the electricity was back on, using dollars in trade had become the norm. A kind of unofficial dollarization took root, partly allowed by Nicolas Maduro, who figured out how to introduce dollars into the economy while keeping the bolivar as the main currency. So, the government gave Venezuelans the option to open checking accounts to deposit their dollars. But don't think these are regular checking accounts. These are accounts where, when you use a debit card to make a payment, the owner receives payment in bolivares. Thanks to this forced conversion, the government manages to keep the demand for bolivares relatively stable, which helps keep its value. So, is the crisis issue solved? Unfortunately, no. Venezuela is still severely hurt by the diaspora of previous years, and many believe that the slight relief experienced is just a bubble about to burst. What's more, the Misery Index, a study developed by economist Arthur Oken based on indicators of inflation, poverty, and employment, projects Venezuela as the second most miserable economy in the world in 2023. So, the crisis just keeps going like a terminal illness for a patient under palliative care. Venezuela, more than anything, is a reminder that too much money spent recklessly is worse than having no money at all.